The mid-15th century in England was a land overshadowed by discontent and uncertainty. The Hundred Years' War, which had once carried the promise of English dominance in France, had ended not in triumph, but in humiliation. Territories that had been won through the brilliance of Edward III and the thunderous victories of Henry V were lost one by one, until only Calais remained as a fragile reminder of former glory. The defeat drained not only the treasury but the pride of the nation. Soldiers who had been hardened by years of fighting returned home restless and without purpose, filling the kingdom with men who knew only war but had no war left to fight. Among the common people, bitterness festered. The glory days of conquest seemed long gone, and in their place was hunger, poverty, and resentment. At the center of this troubled realm stood King Henry VI, a man unlike his warrior ancestors. Where his father, Henry V, had been a fiery and decisive leader, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and painfully indecisive. He sought solace in prayer and charity rather than politics and battle. Though he was kind-hearted and devout, his nature was ill-suited for the brutal realities of kingship in the 15th century. England was a land that demanded strength, force, and vision in its ruler, yet its king was meek, indecisive, and often incapable of making the simplest decisions of governance. To many, Henry's gentleness was not a virtue but a weakness, one that threatened the stability of the realm. The problems of Henry's reign extended beyond his character. England in the 1450s was racked with financial crisis. The cost of the failed wars in France had emptied the royal treasury, and taxes weighed heavily on a population already struggling with bad harvests and inflation. The nobility, many of whom had grown rich and powerful through foreign wars, now turned their ambitions inward. Rival factions formed, each seeking dominance at court. Corruption ran rampant, with royal favorites enriching themselves while the people suffered. Discontent simmered, and whispers spread that perhaps God himself had turned away from England. Then came the king's illness. In 1453, Henry VI fell into a state of near catatonia, unable to speak, recognize his own child, or exercise the duties of a monarch. For over a year, the kingdom effectively had no ruler. At a time when authority was deeply personal, when the physical presence of a king gave legitimacy to government, this collapse was disastrous. It was in this void that Richard, Duke of York, emerged as a figure of immense consequence. Richard was no ordinary noble. His lineage traced back to Edward III through two separate lines, one through Edmund of Langley, another through Lionel of Antwerp, whose bloodline arguably gave him a stronger hereditary claim to the throne than Henry himself. Richard was ambitious, calculating, and politically shrewd. He saw himself as a protector of the realm during the king's incapacity, but he also recognized the deeper truth. The blood in his veins made him more than just a subject. To many, it made him a rightful heir. With Henry incapacitated, Richard was appointed protector of the realm, a role that seemed to place him at the pinnacle of power. For a short time, order returned, and many believed England might yet be saved from collapse. But the king's sudden recovery in 1455 shattered Richard's fragile authority. Henry resumed his position, dismissing Richard, and instead leaned heavily upon his favorite, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a man bitterly despised by Richard. To Richard, Somerset represented corruption, favoritism, and the denial of his rightful influence. From this personal rivalry grew a political crisis that would engulf the nation. The tension between York and Lancaster was not merely a quarrel of personalities, but a clash of dynastic legitimacy. The House of Lancaster, to which Henry VI belonged, had held the throne since Henry IV usurped it from Richard II decades earlier. Yet the House of York, through Lionel of Antwerp, carried a claim of its own, one that Richard of York and his allies would not forget. The conflict between these two houses soon found its symbols, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. In truth, these symbols were rarely used by contemporaries. They were later romanticized by historians and chroniclers. But they captured the essence of a nation divided, two dynasties locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy. For Lancaster, the cause was embodied not in Henry VI, whose passivity made him almost irrelevant, but in his formidable queen, Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was everything her husband was not: fiery, ambitious, and politically ruthless. She refused to allow her husband's weakness to cost her son his inheritance. If Henry could not rule, Margaret would rule in his name, and she would fight tooth and nail to secure the throne for her boy. Richard of York was no less determined. He saw himself as the kingdom's savior, a man who could restore order, end corruption, and bring stability where Henry had failed. He had powerful allies, none more significant than Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, later to be known as the Kingmaker. Warwick's wealth, influence, and charisma made him an invaluable partner, and together with York, he formed the nucleus of the Yorkist cause. The powder keg finally ignited in 1455. Raising his banners, Richard of York marched with his allies to confront the Lancastrians at St. Albans. The battle was brief but decisive. Yorkist forces overwhelmed the king's men, killing Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, and capturing Henry VI himself. The king was once again in York's custody, more a pawn than a monarch. Though small in scale, the First Battle of St. Albans marked a turning point. For the first time in generations, Englishmen fought Englishmen on English soil in open war. Blood had been spilled, and the wound would not heal easily. Yet Richard of York's triumph was incomplete. Capturing the king gave him power, but it also branded him as a rebel in the eyes of many. He had shown that he could raise an army and defeat his enemies, but in doing so, he had unleashed forces beyond his control. Margaret of Anjou, enraged by the death of Somerset and the humiliation of her husband, began to rally the Lancastrian cause with renewed ferocity. To her, this was no longer merely a rivalry between nobles. This was a fight for her son's future, for the survival of the House of Lancaster itself. England found itself trapped in a cycle of uncertainty. Loyalties among the nobility shifted constantly, as lords weighed the risks of backing Lancaster or York. Some families were split, brothers taking opposite sides, fathers and sons fighting against one another. Ordinary people bore the brunt of the conflict, their villages burned, their harvests stolen by marching armies, their lives upended by a war that seemed endless. By the close of the decade, the red rose and the white rose had become more than symbols. They were banners of survival, rallying cries in a conflict that would drag on for more than 30 years. What began as a rivalry between two powerful factions was transforming into a national struggle for legitimacy, power, and survival. England itself had become the battlefield, and its crown the prize. The Wars of the Roses had begun not with a grand declaration, but with mistrust, weakness, and ambition. A king too frail to lead, a queen too determined to surrender, and a duke too ambitious to accept exclusion had plunged the kingdom into civil war. The first battle was over, but the war was only just beginning. In the years to come, the land would be soaked in blood, its nobility decimated, its monarchy shaken to the core. And yet from this chaos, a new dynasty would rise, one that would leave an indelible mark on history. The storm had gathered. England was on the path to decades of turmoil, and there would be no turning back. The first clash at St. Albans had set the stage for what would become a relentless struggle, but in its aftermath, the kingdom still teetered on the edge of uneasy compromise. Richard of York emerged from the battle with the king in his custody, a position that gave him immense leverage. Yet holding Henry VI was both a prize and a burden. The king was the anointed sovereign of England, sacred in the eyes of many, and any mistreatment of him could turn public opinion against the Yorkists. Richard understood this delicate balance. He styled himself not as a usurper, but as a loyal subject acting in the best interest of the realm, a man who merely sought to remove corrupt advisors and restore good governance. For a time, this cautious narrative worked. Richard resumed his role as protector of the realm, and for the moment the fragile peace seemed to hold. Yet beneath the surface, old grievances festered. The death of Somerset at St. Albans was more than the loss of a royal favorite. It was a personal vendetta for Queen Margaret. Fiercely protective of her son, Edward of Westminster, she viewed York as a mortal enemy, a man who threatened the very survival of her family. Her husband might have been meek and indecisive, but Margaret was not. She began to gather allies, weaving together a Lancastrian faction determined to restore her dominance at court and drive York into ruin. The years that followed were marked by shifting alliances and political intrigue. Henry's condition fluctuated, at times showing moments of clarity, at others lapsing into passivity. His inability to rule decisively left a vacuum that others sought to fill. Parliament became an arena of contest, with York and his allies clashing against Margaret's supporters. The kingdom was not yet in open war, but it was deeply fractured. The seeds of suspicion grew, and trust between factions all but disappeared. Tensions boiled over again in 1459. Margaret, unwilling to allow York further influence, pushed for his removal from power. Sensing danger, York and his closest allies, his eldest son Edward, Earl of March, and the Earl of Warwick, raised their banners once more. England braced itself for another round of conflict. This time, however, the scale was far larger. The Battle of Blore Heath in September 1459 saw Yorkist forces under Lord Salisbury ambushed by a Lancastrian army. Despite being outnumbered, the Yorkists fought with desperate ferocity and secured victory, cutting down many of Margaret's supporters. But triumph was short-lived. Later that year at Ludford Bridge, the Yorkists faced the full might of the king's army. When royal pardons were offered to York's men, many deserted, unwilling to be branded traitors against their lawful king. The Yorkist leaders fled into exile, Richard of York to Ireland, Warwick and Edward to Calais. With their enemies gone, Margaret and her faction seized control of government. The Parliament of Devils, held at Coventry in 1459, attainted York and his allies, declaring them traitors and confiscating their lands. It was a brutal attempt to crush the Yorkist cause once and for all. But in doing so, Margaret may have overplayed her hand. By branding such powerful figures as outlaws, she left them with no option but to fight for total victory. The conflict was no longer about influence at court. It had become a fight for survival. In 1460, the exiled Yorkists struck back. Warwick, operating out of Calais, launched raids on the English coast and secured vital support from merchants and nobles disillusioned with Lancastrian rule. Crossing the Channel with Edward of March, Warwick landed in Kent, where his forces quickly swelled in number. On July 10, the Yorkists clashed with a royal army at the Battle of Northampton. In a shocking reversal, Henry VI was captured once more, and the Queen narrowly escaped. With the king again in their hands, the Yorkists marched triumphantly into London. It was at this moment that Richard of York made his boldest move yet. Entering Parliament, he placed his hand upon the throne, as though to claim it. For the first time, York openly signaled his intention not merely to act as protector, but to stake his hereditary claim to the crown itself. Yet the lords of England were not ready to embrace outright usurpation. To depose an anointed king was a radical step, one that many feared would plunge the nation into greater chaos. A compromise was reached in the Act of Accord. Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son Edward, but to Richard of York and his heirs. The agreement was unprecedented, effectively disinheriting the Prince of Wales, a boy of just 7 years old. For Margaret of Anjou, it was intolerable. She would never allow her son to be cast aside in favor of York's children. Gathering her supporters in the north, she raised an army to contest the Act of Accord by force of arms. The result was one of the most brutal clashes of the entire conflict. In December 1460, Richard of York marched north to confront Margaret's forces. At Wakefield, near Sandal Castle, he found himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Lancastrians launched a devastating assault, cutting down the Yorkist army. Richard of York himself was killed in battle, his head placed on a pike above the gates of York with a paper crown mockingly affixed upon it. His son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was slain as he attempted to flee, reputedly butchered in cold blood by Lord Clifford, earning Clifford the grim nickname the Butcher. Wakefield was a catastrophe for the Yorkist cause, but it was far from the end. For Richard's death left behind not a vacuum but a successor, his eldest son, Edward of March. At just 18, Edward inherited not only his father's claim but also his allies and the determination to press forward. Tall, charismatic, and militarily gifted, Edward was everything his father had been and more. He was not content to retreat into exile or accept compromise. Edward would fight to the end, and in him, the Yorkist cause found its most formidable champion. The struggle for England had reached a new and deadly stage. The Act of Accord was torn to pieces on the battlefield, and with York dead, the conflict hardened into a war not just of rival factions but of rival kings. Henry VI remained alive, but his authority was a shadow of itself. Margaret would fight to preserve her son's inheritance, while Edward of March would fight to secure his father's claim. The realm was split in two, and the bloodshed of Wakefield had shown that neither side was prepared to yield. What had begun with disputes in Parliament and skirmishes in market towns had now become a full-scale dynastic war. England was being torn apart, its nobility decimated, its people exhausted. And yet the struggle was far from over. A new Yorkist leader had risen, and with him, the tide of battle was about to turn. The death of Richard of York at Wakefield in December 1460 could easily have shattered his cause beyond repair. His body was desecrated, his heirs declared traitors, and the Lancastrian army surged south with newfound confidence. Yet in the midst of this calamity, the young Edward of March stepped forward to seize the mantle of leadership. Barely out of adolescence, Edward embodied the vigor and charisma his father often lacked. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and carried himself with the natural authority of a man born to rule. More importantly, he possessed a keen military mind and an instinct for seizing opportunity. Edward's first test came almost immediately. While Margaret's army pressed south, a Welsh force loyal to Lancaster threatened his rear. At the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in February 1461, Edward demonstrated both his tactical skill and his ability to inspire men in desperate circumstances. On the morning of battle, a rare atmospheric phenomenon appeared in the sky, 3 suns shining side by side, a parhelion. To frightened soldiers it seemed an omen, but Edward turned it to his advantage. He proclaimed it a sign of the Holy Trinity and of his own destiny, a miracle that foretold victory. With this rallying cry, his army charged into combat and crushed the enemy, cementing Edward's reputation as a leader touched by divine favor. Meanwhile, in the south, Margaret's army won its own brutal triumph at the Second Battle of St. Albans. There, the Lancastrians defeated a Yorkist force and freed King Henry VI from captivity. Yet the victory carried a darker cost. Margaret's troops, many of them from the northern counties, pillaged the countryside, alienating Londoners and southern nobles who might otherwise have supported her. The Queen's reputation as a fierce defender of her son was undeniable, but so too was her association with violence and disorder. When Edward of March marched east and joined forces with Warwick, the political winds began to shift decisively. London, weary of Lancastrian excess, opened its gates to Edward. Here, in the heart of England's capital, the young leader made his boldest move. On March 4, 1461, he was proclaimed King Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England. Unlike his father, Edward did not content himself with compromise or parliamentary recognition. He seized the crown outright, presenting himself as the rightful monarch ordained by heaven and welcomed by the people. Yet proclamation alone was not enough. Henry VI still lived, and Margaret remained at large with a formidable army. Both sides understood that the struggle would be decided not in Parliament or in London but on the battlefield. That battlefield was found at Towton in Yorkshire, on March 29, 1461, Palm Sunday. Towton would become infamous as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The clash began in a blizzard, the snow whipping across the moors and reducing visibility. The Yorkists under Edward and Warwick held the high ground. Their archers, exploiting the wind at their backs, unleashed volleys that tore into the Lancastrian lines. When the arrows of their enemies fell short, the Yorkists retrieved them and fired them back, a cruel twist of fate that sowed panic among Margaret's ranks. Then came the brutal melee. For hours, tens of thousands of men hacked and stabbed in freezing mud, the snow stained crimson with blood. The fighting was relentless, and at times the Yorkists seemed on the verge of collapse. But Edward, towering above his men, fought in the thick of battle, urging them forward. Late in the day, reinforcements under the Duke of Norfolk arrived, tipping the balance. The Lancastrian line finally broke, and what followed was a massacre. As the defeated fled across the River Cock, the bridge collapsed under the weight of men, and the waters ran red with corpses. Chroniclers estimated that as many as 28,000 men lay dead by nightfall, a staggering toll in a kingdom already weary of war. Towton was not merely a battle, it was a national trauma. Entire noble houses were decimated, local communities torn apart by the loss of fathers, sons, and brothers. For Edward, however, it was the decisive victory he needed. With Henry and Margaret in flight, he entered York and ordered the heads of his father and brother removed from the city gates, replacing them with those of Lancastrian lords slain at Towton. The message was clear. The age of York had dawned. Edward IV's reign began in the shadow of Towton's carnage. Unlike Henry VI, he projected vigor and confidence. He rewarded his followers with lands and titles, binding them to his cause. Yet even as he consolidated power, the seeds of future discord were being sown. Warwick, the Kingmaker, whose influence had been instrumental in Edward's rise, expected to guide the young monarch as he had once guided York. But Edward was not content to be ruled. Independent, ambitious, and headstrong, he had his own vision of kingship, one that would eventually put him on a collision course with his most powerful supporter. In the meantime, Henry VI and Margaret were far from finished. They sought refuge in Scotland and later in France, gathering support where they could. Margaret, indomitable as ever, traveled tirelessly in search of allies, presenting her son Edward of Westminster as the rightful heir. For nearly a decade, the Lancastrian cause would smolder, erupting in rebellions and plots that threatened Edward's fragile hold on the throne. The Wars of the Roses were not ended at Towton. They had merely entered a new and more complex phase. For the people of England, the promise of peace remained elusive. The nobles might change banners, kings might be made and unmade, but the common folk bore the brunt of the devastation. Villages were burned, fields trampled, and families broken apart. Chroniclers recorded the bitterness of a nation caught in the grip of endless civil war. The memory of Towton, of thousands dead in a single day, lingered as a reminder of the price of ambition and the fragility of order. Edward IV's early reign thus stood at a crossroads. He had secured his crown through blood and fire, but holding it would demand not only strength in battle but also wisdom in governance. Could he reconcile a divided nobility, heal the wounds of civil war, and prevent his kingdom from sliding once more into chaos? Or would the enmities that had consumed his father's generation return to engulf his own? The Wars of the Roses were far from over, and the struggle for England's destiny had only just begun. Edward IV had seized the crown with the force of arms and the momentum of victory, but the hardest work of kingship awaited him. Winning a throne in battle is one thing, keeping it was another entirely. Edward understood reward and display. He showered his supporters with lands and titles, rebuilt loyalty with generosity, and moved quickly to stamp the authority of York over England. Yet even as he consolidated power, his choices began to sow new discord. The man who had fought his way to the throne married not the diplomatic bride his counselors desired, but Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a Lancastrian family, whose sudden rise from the ranks of the English gentry scandalized many of the great lords. The Woodvilles, thrust into courtly influence, married into noble houses and claimed offices. The old aristocracy bristled at this upstart clan, filling the corridors of power with relatives and favorites. Where Edward had expected gratitude and unity, he found suspicion and envy. At the heart of that envy stood Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick the Kingmaker. Warwick had been Edward's kingmaker indeed. It was his wealth, patronage, and military muscle that had first carried the Yorkist cause to prominence. Possessed of immense land, resources, and charisma, Warwick had been the dominant political figure of the mid-1460s. He had brokered alliances, raised armies, and shaped kings. Yet Warwick was no mere supporter content to stand in the shadow of the crown. He wanted influence, respect, and recognition. He believed that the king who owed him should govern in partnership with him. When Edward turned his back on Warwick's diplomatic plans, marrying for love rather than alliance, the wound cut deep. Warwick's bitterness found company in other disaffected nobles, not least Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. George was handsome, vain, and perpetually hungry for status. Warwick cultivated George as a potential instrument, slowly coaxing the Duke into resentment of his elder brother. The Woodvilles' aggrandizement and their sudden hold on court offices made Clarence feel sidelined, and Warwick played this grievance into a political weapon. Before long, alliances shifted and loyalties realigned. Those who had once marched under white banners now plotted in quiet chambers. The politics of marriage, which in medieval Europe were the currency of power, became the spark. Warwick had long worked to secure a French alliance that would strengthen his position and bind England into continental networks of support. Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville scuttled Warwick's diplomatic plans and humiliated him in public. The Earl's outrage was both personal and political. He had invested blood and reputation to shape the Yorkist ascent, and now saw his influence eroding before his eyes. Disillusioned, he began to weigh other options. To many observers, the idea that Warwick would betray the man he had crowned was unthinkable. Yet politics in this era moved ruthlessly. Loyalties were conditional, and the ambition of a single great man could tip the balance of a nation. Warwick's first decisive act of defiance was to align with George of Clarence, orchestrating a marriage between Clarence and Warwick's own daughter Isabel. This union was not merely familial but strategic, a way to bind a royal duke permanently to the Earl's power base. With Clarence on his side, Warwick had a plausible route to influence that did not require the king's goodwill. But the Earl's ambition did not stop there. In a stunning reversal, Warwick reached across old enmities to negotiate with the very Lancastrian forces he had once destroyed. He opened secret talks with Margaret of Anjou, the relentless queen who had refused to accept defeat, and with émigré Lancastrian nobles who still dreamed of restoring Henry VI. To bring the king he had crowned to heel, Warwick would have to harness the enemy he had once fought, a demonstration of how civil war remakes its friends into foes and its foes into allies. The plot thickened as foreign powers smelled opportunity. Europe's great courts watched England's disarray with interest. A change of regime in London could tilt the continent's fragile alliances. Warwick's diplomacy reached into France and into the courts of the Low Countries. The Earl's enemy, Edward, meanwhile, sought support abroad too, looking to Burgundy and the Burgundian Duke for refuge and assistance when the tide turned. Thus, English civil strife became entangled with continental intrigue. The Wars of the Roses were no longer merely an internal dynastic quarrel, but a theater where European politics and mercenary loyalties played out. By 1469, the rupture between king and kingmaker had become irreparable. Warwick and Clarence raised forces in open rebellion, moving through the Midlands with a mixture of nobles, levies, and enraged retainers. Edward tried to respond with force, but fortunes in war are fickle, and the popular mood in the south had cooled. In 1470, the king's position collapsed with astonishing speed. Enterprise and miscalculation, court jealousies, and the fervent maneuvering of Warwick converged. Edward chose to flee, seeking sanctuary in the Low Countries under the protection of the Duke of Burgundy. It was a humiliating exile for a king who had once ridden triumphant from Towton. Warwick's counterstroke seemed complete. In October 1470, he marched into London with a Lancastrian army at his side. Henry VI, the man whose weakness had sparked the wars, was restored to the throne in an event known as the Redemption. For many, the restoration was anathema. The gentle Henry, once mocked, again sat in a turbulent court dominated by those who had once been his rivals. Warwick, now the power behind the throne, attempted to govern through compromise, but the arrangement was unsustainable. The alliance with Margaret of Anjou and the French exiles was uneasy and distrustful. The nation had not suddenly healed by the mere sight of a king returned. Even as Warwick celebrated his success, Edward IV was far from finished. In exile, he moved with quiet determination, securing mercenaries, ships, and the backing of Burgundian allies who disliked Warwick's newfound French entanglements. The exiled king's return in March 1471 was swift and dramatic. A fleet slipped past English watch, and Edward landed on the coast with a small but decisive force. The stage was set for a showdown that would settle the question of who would rule England. On April 14, 1471, the armies met at Barnet in a fog-shrouded field. The battle was chaotic. Mist and smoke turned the scene into a blur, friend and foe often indistinguishable. Errors of misidentification and poor communication led to deadly mistakes. Warwick, once the master of battlefield command, found himself fighting amid confusion. In the carnage, he was cut down. His death was a decisive psychological blow as much as a tactical one. The loss of the Kingmaker broke the back of the opposition to Edward. The Earl's body was buried ignominiously, and his head later displayed on London Bridge, a grim token of the king's restored supremacy. But the tragedy and violence were not over. Less than a month after Barnet, forces loyal to Edward routed the remaining Lancastrian resistance at Tewkesbury. There, the young Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's son, was killed, ending the direct Lancastrian line and extinguishing the most immediate hope of Margaret and her followers. Margaret herself was captured. The fierce queen who had once ridden to war for her child was reduced to pleading for mercy. Henry VI's final fate followed swiftly. In the Tower of London, shortly after the battle, the weak king died under mysterious circumstances, a death that many suspected was more than natural. Whether murdered by agents of Edward or left to die of despair and neglect, Henry's end closed a tragic chapter in the Civil War. Edward IV's restoration was bloody and ruthless, but it also brought a measure of stability. With Warwick gone and the Lancastrian line broken, Edward set about consolidating his rule. He rewarded loyal followers, reasserted royal prerogative, and moved to restore normalcy to a country exhausted by years of intermittent warfare. Yet the memory of betrayal lingered. The spectacle of a kingmaker turning kingbreaker, of brothers trading blows for titles and daughters marrying into power, had left deep scars. The Wars of the Roses had not produced neat victories or heroic ideals. They had produced bitterness, revenge, and a lesson in the perils of unchecked ambition. In the end, the episode left England with a paradox. The crown was secure for the moment, but the mechanisms that had enabled paper claims to be enforced by sword, the complex web of noble patronage, shifting marriage alliances, and personal vendettas, remained in place. Edward had won back his throne, but he had also learned that kingship in an era of powerful nobles was never merely the right of blood or law. It depended on the fragile architecture of support that could be built or shattered by a single marriage, a single insult, a single death. The age of York had survived Warwick's betrayal, but the kingdom remained a tinderbox, ready to flare again at the slightest spark. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic and contested episodes in English history. For over 2 decades, Edward had maintained a fragile stability after years of chaos. His charisma, military skill, and political savvy had allowed him to reign with relative strength. though beneath the surface tensions lingered. His sudden death at the age of only 40, after a short illness, left his kingdom vulnerable once again. The throne passed to his eldest son, Edward V, who was just 12 years old. In theory, the boy's minority would be overseen by a council of regency led by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In practice, this succession unleashed suspicion, rivalry, and ambition that would plunge England back into bloodshed. Richard of Gloucester, Edward IV's youngest brother, had long been loyal to him. Unlike their brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had betrayed Edward and paid with his life, Richard had shown steadfastness both in war and in governance. He was an able commander, trusted administrator, and popular in the north of England, where he served as Edward's representative. When the king died, Richard was named protector of the realm until young Edward V came of age. At first, this appeared to be a sensible arrangement. Richard's loyalty was assumed, and his reputation for honor gave confidence that he would safeguard his nephew's throne. But within weeks, events took a darker turn. As Edward V traveled from Ludlow to London for his coronation, Richard intercepted him. Accompanied by powerful allies such as Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Richard took custody of the boy and placed him in the Tower of London, which, though a royal residence, carried ominous associations. Soon after, Edward's younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was also lodged in the Tower. The justification was practical, to secure the boys until the coronation. But suspicions grew that Gloucester intended something far more ambitious. Richard and his supporters launched a campaign to delegitimize Edward V's claim. They alleged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because he was previously betrothed to another woman. If true, this would render all of Edward's children illegitimate. On this basis, Parliament declared that Edward V had no right to the throne. In June 1483, Richard of Gloucester was proclaimed King Richard III. The coronation was swift, and the young princes in the Tower were never seen again. Their disappearance remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Many believe Richard ordered their murder to secure his crown, though some historians argue that others, including the Duke of Buckingham or even Henry Tudor, may have been responsible. What is certain is that their vanishing fatally stained Richard's reputation, branding him as a usurper and child killer in the eyes of his enemies. Richard III's reign was troubled from the outset. Though he showed administrative talent, reducing corruption in courts and trying to stabilize royal finances, he never shook off the taint of suspicion. His rise to power alienated many former Yorkists who had loyally served Edward IV. Elizabeth Woodville and her allies, stripped of influence, turned against him. The Woodville family secretly aligned with Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant in exile across the Channel. Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort, conspired tirelessly to place her son on the throne, forging alliances with disaffected nobles. Even the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, rebelled against him in 1483, though this uprising failed and Buckingham was executed. Yet resistance continued to grow. Henry Tudor, though his claim to the throne was tenuous, descended from John of Gaunt through the illegitimate Beaufort line, became a rallying point for opponents of Richard. His exile in Brittany shielded him from Richard's reach, while his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, offered a powerful unifying symbol. Such a union could reconcile the warring houses of Lancaster and York, ending decades of conflict. This prospect attracted widespread support, turning Henry from a minor exile into a serious contender. By 1485, Henry Tudor was ready to act. With French backing and a small force of mercenaries and supporters, he sailed from France and landed in Wales. His march across the countryside gathered strength, drawing supporters eager to see Richard overthrown. Richard, meanwhile, mobilized his forces and marched to meet the invaders. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, one of the most decisive battles in English history. Richard III fought with extraordinary courage. Chroniclers record that he led a direct charge toward Henry himself, determined to end the battle with a single blow. But Richard's gamble failed. His forces were betrayed by key allies, including the Stanley family, who held back until the tide of battle turned. When they finally intervened, it was on Henry's side. Surrounded and unhorsed, Richard refused to flee. He was cut down in the thick of the fighting, the last English king to die on the battlefield. According to legend, he cried, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," though this line likely owes more to Shakespeare than to history. His crown was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head, marking the dawn of a new dynasty. Richard's death ended the Plantagenet line that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. Henry was crowned Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. True to his promise, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York into the iconic Tudor rose. This marriage symbolized reconciliation and peace after 30 years of civil war. Yet, Henry's reign was far from simple. He faced repeated rebellions and pretenders claiming to be Yorkist heirs, such as Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. But Henry proved a shrewd and determined ruler, consolidating power, restoring royal finances, and laying the foundations for a strong monarchy that his son, Henry VII, and granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would expand into an empire. The Wars of the Roses were over, but their legacy endured. The decades of strife had decimated the old nobility, destroyed dynasties, and reshaped England's political landscape. The memory of betrayal, ambition, and bloodshed lingered, immortalized in chronicles and later in Shakespeare's plays. The image of Richard III as a hunchbacked villain, though exaggerated by Tudor propaganda, became one of the most enduring portrayals in English cultural memory. Only in recent times, with the discovery of his remains beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, has a more nuanced picture begun to emerge. What is undeniable is that the Wars of the Roses transformed England. From the chaos of rival dynasties arose the Tudors, a new line of monarchs who would oversee the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the expansion of England's power abroad. But these achievements rested on the bones of tens of thousands who had fallen in battles from St. Albans to Towton, Barnet to Bosworth. Their blood paved the way for the end of medieval England and the dawn of a new era. And so the war that began with questions of legitimacy and rivalry between cousins ended with a new dynasty, forged in blood and sealed with marriage. The Wars of the Roses were not simply a struggle for a crown. They were a crucible that reshaped monarchy, nobility, and the very identity of England itself. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 had brought a dramatic conclusion to decades of bloody conflict, but the end of Richard III did not mean an immediate peace for England. Henry Tudor, now crowned Henry VII, faced the daunting task of transforming his fragile victory into a lasting dynasty. The Wars of the Roses had devastated the country, shattered trust among the nobility, and left scars that would not heal overnight. To secure his throne, Henry would need to outmaneuver enemies, suppress rebellions, and convince a war-weary realm that he could provide the stability it so desperately craved. Henry's claim to the throne was, in truth, precarious. His descent from John of Gaunt through the Beaufort line was tainted by illegitimacy, and he had gained the crown by conquest, not hereditary right. This is why his marriage to Elizabeth of York was so critical. Their union symbolized the reconciliation of Lancaster and York, embodied in the new emblem of the Tudor rose, a fusion of the red and white roses. Yet this union was carefully timed. Henry had himself crowned king before the marriage, ensuring that his authority came not through his wife's Yorkist blood, but from his own victory on the battlefield. In this way, he made it clear that Elizabeth was queen consort, not the source of his legitimacy. The early years of Henry's reign were plagued with challenges. Many nobles still harbored loyalty to the Yorkist cause, and the disappearance of the young princes in the Tower left open the dangerous possibility of pretenders. In 1487, Only 2 years after Bosworth, Yorkist rebels rose in support of Lambert Simnel, a boy claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence. Though the real Warwick was imprisoned in the Tower, the impostor was crowned in Dublin as King Edward VI and backed by Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV and Richard III. Henry acted decisively. He paraded the real Warwick through London to expose the deception, then marched against the rebels. At the Battle of Stoke Field, Henry's forces crushed the uprising, in what is often considered the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. Simnel was captured and, showing the pragmatism that defined his reign, Henry spared the boy, assigning him work in the royal kitchens. His adult supporters were not so fortunate. Another threat emerged in the form of Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower. Warbeck gained recognition from several European powers, including Burgundy, Scotland, and even the Holy Roman Emperor. His cause troubled Henry for years, with intermittent invasions and plots. But in the end, Warbeck was captured and executed in 1499, his death marking the fatting of serious Yorkist threats. With these rebellions suppressed, Henry could finally begin to consolidate his dynasty. Henry's approach to kingship was markedly different from the flamboyant style of Edward IV or the reckless ambition of Richard III. He was cautious, calculating, and frugal, often described as cold and suspicious. He reduced the power of the nobility through laws against retaining private armies, and he expanded the use of the Court of Star Chamber to enforce royal justice. By carefully managing royal finances, he restored the crown's wealth and independence from overmighty lords. His diplomacy was equally shrewd. Through marriages and treaties, he strengthened England's position in Europe, marrying his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, and securing recognition of his dynasty. The legacy of Henry VII was not one of dazzling military victories or grand displays, but of survival. Against all odds, he established a stable monarchy after decades of instability. His reign was the foundation upon which his son, Henry VII, and granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would build a powerful Tudor state. The Wars of the Roses had shown the dangers of weak kingship and unchecked noble power. Henry's solution was to centralize authority in the crown and rule with vigilance. Looking back, the Wars of the Roses had been more than a dynastic quarrel. They were a turning point in English history, marking the decline of medieval feudalism and the rise of a more modern monarchy. The war decimated the ranks of the old nobility. Powerful families who had once challenged royal authority on the battlefield were destroyed or diminished. In their place, a new nobility emerged, dependent on the favor of the crown rather than hereditary power. This shift allowed the Tudors to rule with unprecedented strength. The cultural memory of the wars endured long after the battles ended. Chroniclers recorded the bloodshed and betrayals, while later writers, most famously William Shakespeare, immortalized the figures of the era in drama. His portrayal of Richard III as a deformed villain cemented the king's dark reputation for centuries, though modern scholarship and the rediscovery of Richard's skeleton in 2012 have challenged this image. Still, the power of Shakespeare's narrative demonstrates how the Wars of the Roses became not just history but myth, shaping England's understanding of its own past. For ordinary people, the wars were catastrophic. Villages were emptied of men conscripted into armies, fields were left untended, and families were torn apart by shifting loyalties. The Battle of Towton alone, fought in 1461, may have claimed as many as 20,000 lives, making it the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The endless cycles of betrayal and revenge created an atmosphere of distrust and fear that seeped into the fabric of society. Peace under the Tudors was thus welcomed not only by nobles, but by common folk desperate for stability after decades of turmoil. The Wars of the Roses also altered England's place in the wider world. While civil war consumed the realm, France consolidated its strength, and Scotland took advantage of England's weakness. The eventual stability under the Tudors allowed England to reassert itself, first under Henry VII's careful diplomacy and later with the more aggressive policies of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I in this sense. The bloodshed of the 15th century cleared the stage for the dramatic transformations of the 16th. As the 15th century closed, England stood changed. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled for more than 300 years, was gone, extinguished in a series of violent struggles. The Tudors, a family once considered minor and unremarkable, now held the crown. Their reign would not be without its own upheavals, religious schism, political intrigue, and international conflict, but the dynasty endured for over a century, guiding England into the modern age. The Wars of the Roses remain a story of ambition, betrayal, and resilience. They remind us how fragile power can be, how family rivalries can topple kingdoms, and how the fate of nations often hinges on the ambitions of a few. Yet they also show the capacity of a people to endure and to rebuild. Out of decades of war, England emerged scarred but transformed, with a monarchy stronger than ever before. From the first clash at St. Albans in 1455 to the final victory of Henry Tudor in 1487, the wars spanned more than 30 years of intermittent conflict. They saw the fall of kings, the rise of unlikely rulers, and the reshaping of English society. And though the red rose and the white rose may have faded into history, their legacy lives on in the Tudor rose, a symbol of unity forged from division, peace won from chaos, and the birth of modern England from the ashes of civil war.